And I honour the first Australians whose cultures we celebrate as the oldest continuing cultures in human history. And Natasha, when you speak of pride in our Indigenous cultures, it is something we in this room should own in our hearts and in our minds for the future. When I speak to gatherings around the world and I say that it is our honour to share this continent with the oldest continuing cultures in human history, the room, wherever it is, falls silent. No other of the 193 member states of the United Nations can say that. Together, let us own our Indigenous cultures with the most profound pride. To all members of the Stolen Generation here with us today, to all of our Indigenous brothers and sisters, to the leaders of the National Congress of Australia's First Peoples, to all of our Indigenous members of Parliament, you honour us by your presence. To the Leader of the Opposition, thank you for your remarks today. To Brendan Nelson, the Leader of the Liberal Party, who joined with me in supporting that resolution of the House 10 years ago. To all other members of Parliament, of the House and the Senate here today. And finally, to Nana Fijo. You may recall her a decade ago, 82 years old. I rang her yesterday. She's 92 in Darwin. And she brings you her greetings from the Northern Territory. I asked Nana Fijo what her message to this gathering would be in the Great Hall today, and she said, very simple, tell them to behave. For many of us, 10 years may seem like an eternity. For our long-suffering Indigenous brothers and sisters, it is not. The national apology to Indigenous Australians came fully 220 years after European settlement, when these lands, which were their lands, were taken from them. And European settlement itself had come 60,000 years after our first peoples first came to this ancient continent, Gondwanaland, or the nation we now call Australia. We, therefore, have lived through little more than the blinking of an eye. So when taken across this great arc of time, what is it that we sought to do in this place, in what was said here a decade ago? Of course, the answer we are quick to give is reconciliation, or at least with the national apology, one long step along the road to reconciliation, whereby we could begin to look each other in the eye without recrimination and instead with respect and as equal members of our national family. No one can deny that this is good, particularly where we have been as a nation in the past, in the difficult history of race in this country. Yet the uncomfortable truth is that this is only one part of the answer, and perhaps, in the larger part, a whitefellas answer. As if it was as much a need for Indigenous Australians who had done no wrong to us to be reconciled with white Australians, as it was our need as white Australians to be reconciled with our Indigenous brothers and sisters whom we had demonstrably wronged. Remembering all along that the power in this relationship remained comfortably in the hands of those of us who are white. So to go to the heart of the matter, the time has come for us to listen to the considered voice of our Indigenous peoples themselves, rather than our interpretation of what we think Indigenous Australia ought to be saying about their future, including the long national discourse we have had on constitutional recognition. And to do this, we must turn to the statement of the heart from Uluru, not that long ago, a statement from the very heart of this great ancient continent itself, however discomforting many Australians may have found that statement. The confronting truth of Uluru is that it is a call for the recognition of Indigenous sovereignty. As the statement says, our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander tribes were the first sovereign nations of the Australian continent and its adjacent islands. This sovereignty is a spiritual notion, the ancestral tie between the land and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. It has never been ceded or extinguished and coexists with the sovereignty of the Crown. The Uluru Statement continues. We seek constitutional reforms to empower our people and take a rightful place in our own country. When we have power over our destiny, our children will flourish. They will walk in two worlds, and their culture will be a gift to their country. The statement concludes with its now famous call for the constitutional recognition of a First Nations voice, the establishment under law of a Makarrata Commission, with the ultimate objective of a treaty. These are large claims. They certainly shocked the government. They also shocked the rest of Australian polite society, even polite progressive society. But these, nonetheless, were now the considered claims of Indigenous Australia and their leadership assembled at Uluru. The core logic is that reconciliation between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians and enduring justice for Indigenous Australians can only be achieved through the recognition of this form of sovereignty, and then given concrete expression through three specific institutions: a First Nations voice, a Makarrata Commission, and through that a treaty between Australia's First Nations and the Crown. It is unfortunate that these were so casually brushed aside by the Prime Minister after so many months of silence. The beginning of wisdom in the difficult processes of reconciliation in this country over more than half a century is to treat the considered requests of Indigenous Australia with respect, rather than reject it out of hand because they were not what we expected. Uluru should instead have become the beginning of a new national conversation about an Indigenous national voice, rather than the doors to that conversation being slammed shut. The argument has been made that these recommendations would lead to an unequal Australia. This begs the question of the unequal nature of Australia as it stands right now. The argument has also been made that the creation of a First Nations voice under the Constitution would create a third chamber of the Parliament. This, I respectfully submit, is nonsense, given that under the proposals made, this body would have advisory powers only. Moreover, these advisory powers would relate only to the exercise of the existing constitutional powers of the executive government to make laws for Indigenous peoples. Furthermore, the First Nations voice, unlike the House or the Senate, could not legislate. It could only advise. The question arises, therefore, as to why such a First Nations voice could be seen as so constitutionally obnoxious. Or is it just a question of being seen by some as politically obnoxious, which is a different matter altogether. The same, I fear, applies to the question of a treaty. Other settler societies around the world have treaties with their First Peoples. One of them lies just across the water from us. It's called New Zealand. And that country does not seem to have been rent asunder as a result. It seems, my friends, that we are often all too fearful in this country of anything that is new, rather than realising that perhaps old problems may indeed require new solutions if we are to deal with them at their heart. And at its heart, Uluru is a request for shared sovereignty, not white charity, for therein lies essential dignity. So as a former Prime Minister of this country, my request respectfully of our current Prime Minister is to reopen this dialogue with First Australians on this statement of the heart. None of this is easy. All of it is hard. It's been like that all along. It was like that with the 1967 referendum, all hard until it was done. It was like that with E.G. Whitlam, the Northern Territory Land Act, the Racial Discrimination Act, all hard, very hard, until it was done. It was like that with P.J. Keating, the Redfern Statement, Mabo, the Native Title Act, the act that we were told at the time would destroy the mining industry. That was about 1 decade before we had the biggest mining boom of all in this country. All hard until it is done. It was like that with the Bringing Them Home report, the Stolen Generations, and National Sorry Day marches across the country, all hard until it was done. So too with the national apology, when we were told that the sky would fall in. So too with closing the gap, when we are told that the sky is still falling in. All hard until it is done. And so too will it be with Uluru, the First Nations voice and treaty. All hard until it is done. What is necessary in all these is political resolve. What is necessary in all these is political leadership. And with resolve and with leadership, we will get there. The Australia of the future, an Australia fully reconciled with its past, an Australia where we are truly equal and where the gap has been closed, an Australia where our sovereignty is shared with our First Peoples, and so become an Australia that is a beacon for the world. I thank you.